Detective Daniel Carter had seen it all during his years on the force. Murder, theft, fraud. He'd dealt with it all. But nothing had prepared him for the case that would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty and trust. It all started when Daniel first met Amy Harrison. She was married to his partner, Officer Mark Harrison. Mark and Daniel had worked together for over a decade, but Amy was someone Daniel had only seen in passing during a few social gatherings. She was attractive, confident, and in his eyes, the perfect woman. There was just one problem. She was married. It wasn't long before Daniel found himself in the same circles as Amy more often. Her husband, Mark, often worked long shifts, leaving Amy with plenty of time on her hands. Daniel and Amy started talking more. She'd confide in him about her frustrations with Mark, how he was always busy with work, neglecting her needs. Daniel listened, offering a comforting ear, and before long, the lines between professionalism and personal feelings blurred. The affair started innocently at first. They shared a few drinks, exchanged stories, and soon enough, they found themselves in a hotel room together. It was supposed to be just one night, just a way to relieve some tension. But it wasn't. One night turned into several, and before they knew it, they were trapped in a secret affair neither of them could easily walk away from. Daniel was aware of the risks. He knew the consequences if anyone found out, but he couldn't stop. Every time he saw Amy, he was drawn deeper into the web they were weaving. She had become more than just his partner's wife. She was someone he couldn't live without. Amy, on the other hand, was torn between guilt and desire. She loved her husband, but the emotional and physical connection she had with Daniel was something she hadn't felt in years. The more she spent time with him, the more she found herself resenting Mark for not being the man she needed him to be. At work, Daniel kept his distance from Mark, trying to act like everything was normal. They continued their shifts together, responding to calls, solving cases, all while Daniel's mind was elsewhere. Amy and Daniel's affair continued behind Mark's back, a secret that weighed heavily on both of them. As the affair progressed, tensions at home grew. Mark noticed Amy's increasing distance, her coldness during their brief interactions. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. He started asking questions, but Amy always had an excuse. "I'm just tired," she'd say, or "Work has been stressful." Mark trusted his wife, but a part of him felt like he was losing her, and he had no idea why. Daniel's life, too, began to change. The constant lying, sneaking around, and hiding the truth was exhausting. He started to wonder if it was all worth it. But every time Amy smiled at him, every time they met in secret, the doubts faded away. He couldn't let go. Things seemed to be spiraling out of control, but neither Daniel nor Amy could stop. They were living in a dangerous game, and they both knew that if anyone found out, their lives would be destroyed. But neither of them could foresee the terrible consequence that awaited them. It wasn't just the affair that would bring everything crashing down. It was the slow unraveling of the trust between the three of them that would set the stage for a deadly betrayal. The affair between Daniel and Amy continued in secret, each encounter deepening their connection, but also feeding the guilt and unease that grew in both of them. Their world, once neatly divided into compartments, was becoming more difficult to maintain. Daniel's work life was starting to show the cracks, the distractions, the late nights, and the distant look in his eyes when he should have been focused. His performance as a police officer was slipping, but the affair seemed to numb him, making everything else fade into the background. Amy, too, was living with a constant weight on her shoulders. She had become more distant from Mark, and though he tried to keep their relationship alive, it was becoming clear to him that something wasn't right. He started coming home earlier from work, trying to catch Amy in the act of something, anything that might explain the change in her. But every time he questioned her, she denied everything, offering up the same tired excuses. One evening, Mark returned home unexpectedly after a long day. Amy was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone. She didn't look up when he entered, and that more than anything, sent a cold shiver down Mark's spine. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice trembled slightly. Amy blinked, snapping out of her trance. "Oh, Mark, you're home early," she replied, her tone lacking its usual warmth. Mark didn't buy it. "Is everything okay? You seem off lately." Amy's heart began to race. She had practiced her responses, the lines she would use to push him away when he started getting too close to the truth. "I'm fine, just tired. Work's been a lot lately," she said, offering him a faint smile. But Mark wasn't convinced. He looked at her for a long moment, as if he could see through her. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like hours, before he finally spoke again. "I don't know what's going on, Amy, but I feel like you're pulling away from me, and I don't know how to fix it." Amy opened her mouth to reply, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him the truth, to stop the lies, but a part of her couldn't bring herself to do it. She had once loved Mark, but now she felt like she was suffocating in a life that no longer made sense. Instead, she reached for her phone, tapping the screen in an attempt to distract herself from the painful conversation unfolding before her. Mark noticed. His gaze dropped to her phone, and something shifted in him. He had seen the way she reacted when she spoke to it. Her eyes would light up whenever it rang, her fingers would fly across the screen, and she would always make sure the conversation stayed private. Mark's instincts kicked in. He knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't prove it. "Who are you talking to, Amy?" he asked, his voice low, but the tension in his tone was unmistakable. Amy's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that one day Mark would catch on, but she never expected it to happen like this. She quickly put the phone down and looked away. "It's nothing. Just work stuff." Mark took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me, Amy. I'm not an idiot. Who is it?" Amy froze. In that moment, she realized that her marriage, her entire life, was about to unravel, and the man standing before her had the power to bring it all crashing down. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but there was no turning back. She could lie, deny it, but she knew deep down that Mark was getting closer to the truth. "I've been seeing someone," Amy finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark recoiled, as though struck by the force of her words. "What? Who?" Amy closed her eyes, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "It's Daniel," she confessed. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Mark's face went pale, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Amy's admission, the words she had dreaded saying out loud, seemed to suck the air out of the room. Mark turned away, his back to her. He couldn't look at her. "How long?" "Months," Amy replied, her voice shaky. She had never been more ashamed, yet she couldn't stop herself from speaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. It just did." The silence between them grew heavy. Mark felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him, like everything he had believed in had been shattered in an instant. His partner, his friend, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. "I need some air," Mark said, his voice strained. He grabbed his coat, and without another word, he stormed out of the house, leaving Amy standing there, consumed by guilt and fear. She knew things would never be the same again, but she wasn't prepared for the storm that was coming. Meanwhile, Daniel was dealing with his own emotions. He had heard rumors from the precinct about Mark's sudden change in behavior, his increasing tension at home, but he had no idea how close Mark was to discovering the truth. It was a cold, rainy night when the storm finally hit. Mark had spent the entire day brooding, following Amy and Daniel, trying to catch them in the act. He had seen enough to know that the affair was real. Amy had tried to act normal, but the guilt in her eyes was impossible to hide. Daniel, on the other hand, had become more distant, distracted, unshaven, and constantly looking over his shoulder like he was being hunted. Neither of them knew just how close Mark was to the truth. That evening, Mark couldn't take it any longer. His anger had built to a boiling point, and he had made up his mind. He would confront Daniel. He had to know why. Why Daniel? Why had his best friend and partner betrayed him? The thought of his partner, the man he trusted with his life, sleeping with his wife, had pushed him to the edge. He was no longer thinking clearly, consumed by rage and the need for answers. He drove to Daniel's apartment, each mile feeling like a weight pressing down on him. The wipers slapped back and forth across the windshield as the rain poured harder. He couldn't stop shaking. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The thought of Amy, of what she had done, made his chest tighten with grief. But it was more than just grief now. It was a primal need for justice, for closure. Daniel had just gotten home from work, tired but relieved that the day was over. He hadn't expected to hear the sharp knock on his door. He opened it slowly, and there stood Mark, his face twisted in a grimace of anger and hurt. "What do you want, Mark?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He had no idea what was coming. "I want answers, Daniel," Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know what you've been doing with my wife." Daniel's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected this confrontation to happen tonight, but now that it was here, he felt a cold sweat break out across his back. He tried to keep his composure, but the truth was there, hanging in the air like a weight neither of them could escape. "Mark, Daniel began, but Mark cut him off. "Don't try to lie to me, I've seen it. I know what you've been doing behind my back." Mark's fists clenched, his jaw tight. "You betrayed me. I trusted you." The words stung more than Daniel anticipated. He had always considered Mark a brother, someone he could trust, but now he could feel the rage radiating from him, a palpable force that made the air in the room thick with tension. "I didn't want this to happen, Mark," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly. It just did. I never meant to hurt you." Mark took a step forward, his eyes burning with anger. "You think that excuses it? That you can just sleep with my wife and expect me to understand?" He took another step, his chest heaving with the effort to keep his emotions in check. "You don't get it. You don't understand what you've done to me." Daniel knew things were escalating quickly. He had been trained for confrontations, for high-pressure situations, but nothing could have prepared him for the fury that was pouring from Mark. He took a step back, instinctively putting distance between them. "I'm sorry, Mark. I am," Daniel said, his voice almost pleading now. "But I can't change what's happened. I can't take it back." Mark's eyes narrowed, his hands balled into fists, his body trembling with suppressed rage. "You think that's enough?" he hissed. "You think an apology is going to fix this?" Mark was no longer thinking clearly. His vision was clouded by anger, his thoughts a blur of betrayal and pain. His mind screamed at him to hurt Daniel, to make him feel the same agony he was feeling. And as the words left his mouth, his hands moved without thinking, grabbing Daniel by the collar and pushing him back into the apartment. Daniel stumbled, his heart racing in his chest. He had never seen Mark like this. He had never seen him so consumed by rage. Mark's hands tightened around his collar, lifting him off the ground slightly. Daniel gasped for air, his thoughts racing as he tried to pull away. "Mark, let go of me!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse. But Mark wasn't listening. The pain and anger boiled over, and in a sudden, violent outburst, he shoved Daniel backward. Daniel hit the coffee table hard, sending it crashing to the floor, but he managed to regain his balance, struggling to stay on his feet. The two men faced each other, breathing heavily. Mark was seething, his entire body shaking with fury. Daniel, equally shaken, stood at the ready, but he knew there was no way to talk his way out of this. It had gone too far. The tension between them had escalated beyond anything he could have anticipated. Suddenly, Mark lunged forward, knocking Daniel to the ground. He straddled him, pinning his arms to the floor. Daniel tried to fight back, but Mark's grip was too strong. The morning after Daniel's death, the precinct was thrown into chaos. News of the murder spread like wildfire, and the police force was buzzing with speculation. Everyone was shocked by the violent nature of the crime, especially given Daniel's reputation as a solid officer. He was well-liked, respected, and had never shown any signs of personal turmoil that might have led to such a tragic end. It didn't make sense. Detective Sarah Mitchell was assigned to lead the investigation. She was a seasoned investigator with years of experience, a sharp mind, and an instinct for finding the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. When she arrived at Daniel's apartment, the scene was already cordoned off. The forensics team was busy collecting evidence, and the uniformed officers were trying to keep the growing crowd of curious neighbors and co-workers at bay. Sarah stood at the edge of the crime scene, taking in the details. Daniel's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a middle-class neighborhood. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The place was tidy, almost too tidy for someone who had been brutally murdered just hours before. The coffee table, broken in two, was the focal point of the scene. It was clear that it had been used to bludgeon Daniel, likely the weapon that ended his life. The forensic team was gathering blood samples and taking photographs of the body, which was sprawled across the floor, his skull crushed in multiple places. The violence of the crime was shocking, but Sarah had seen worse. What intrigued her was the lack of any immediate suspects. There were no obvious signs of a robbery or an altercation that had gone wrong. It wasn't a random attack. Whoever had done this had been in control of their actions, even in the midst of the frenzy. Detective Mitchell, one of the officers called, breaking her focus. He handed her a report from the initial sweep of the apartment. No signs of struggle, just the blood at the crime scene. No personal items appear to be missing, and there's no sign of forced entry. Sarah nodded, scanning the report. Who was Daniel close to? Anyone who might have a motive to harm him? The officer hesitated. Well, detective, his partner, Officer Mark Harrison, is the one who found him. Mark's been acting strange since he showed up. We thought it was just the shock, but it's weird. He keeps saying he didn't know what happened, but his behavior. Sarah's ears perked up at the mention of Mark Harrison. She knew him. He was a good cop, steady under pressure, but she also knew that even the best officers had secrets. She motioned for the officer to lead her to Mark. Mark Harrison was sitting in an interview room when Sarah entered. He was staring at the table, his hands resting in front of him, still trembling slightly. His uniform was neat, but there was a disheveled look about him, like he had spent the night awake, wrestling with his thoughts. Officer Harrison, Sarah said, sitting across from him. I'm Detective Sarah Mitchell. I'm in charge of the investigation into your partner's death. Mark looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep. He swallowed hard. I don't know what happened. I found him like that. I didn't do it. I'm not saying you did, Sarah replied calmly, her gaze steady. But we need to understand what happened. You were the one who found Daniel. Tell me about that. What was going through your mind? Mark rubbed his face with his hands as though trying to gather his thoughts. He spoke slowly, his voice heavy with fatigue. I came home early. I was worried about Amy. Things between us had been strained for a while. I thought maybe she'd been seeing someone, and I needed to know the truth. I didn't know if I should confront her, but I came home, and she was acting weird, distant. So I decided to go see Daniel. He's been my partner for years. I thought maybe he could help me figure things out, talk to me, give me some advice. I never thought I'd find him dead. He paused, his voice cracking with emotion. I don't know what happened. I went to his place and he was just there. I didn't know what to do. I called for help. I didn't touch anything. Sarah watched him closely. His story seemed genuine, but something about his tone was off. He was too calm, too controlled for someone who had just discovered his best friend's body in such a brutal state. Mark Harrison was no rookie. He knew how to hide his emotions when needed. And when you found him, Sarah pressed, were there any signs of struggle between you and Daniel? Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. Nothing like that. I didn't touch him. I just called it in. I couldn't believe it was him, not Daniel, not my partner. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. All right, we're going to need to talk to Amy as well. Detective Sarah Mitchell's next move was clear. She needed to speak to Amy Harrison. The grief-stricken wife of the murdered officer was a key piece in the puzzle, and Sarah knew that Amy might hold the answers that would shed light on the situation. But Amy's emotions were raw. Sarah had to approach her carefully. If Amy knew anything about her husband's involvement in Daniel's death, or if she was somehow connected, Sarah needed to get her to open up without alienating her. Amy was sitting in her living room when Sarah arrived at the house, her face pale and weary from a night of restless sleep. She had barely slept at all since Mark's revelation of Daniel's murder. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her movements were slow, as though she were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Mrs. Harrison, Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband and your relationship with Officer Daniel Carter. It's important for the investigation. Amy's eyes widened, and she instinctively shifted in her seat, a sense of panic flickering across her face. She hadn't expected the police to come to her so soon, let alone ask about her involvement in Daniel's death. The weight of the last few days, the lies, and the secrecy that had consumed her life for months now threatened to come crashing down. I don't know what I can tell you, Amy stammered. Mark and we've been through so much, but Daniel, he was a good man. He didn't deserve this. We didn't deserve this. I understand, Mrs. Harrison, Sarah replied, keeping her tone calm and professional. But it's important that we piece together what happened. I need you to think back to the days leading up to Daniel's murder. Was there anything unusual? Any signs that Daniel was in trouble? Or maybe something strange about Mark's behavior? Amy hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the window as though she were searching for an escape. Her mind raced back to the night before Daniel's death, the final confrontation between her husband and her lover. She remembered the quiet, awkward dinner she and Mark had shared before he left. Mark had been distant, as if he knew something was wrong, but had said nothing. She had tried to brush it off, focusing on the fact that she would see Daniel that night. She hadn't expected it to end like this. Mark finding out, and Daniel dead in the apartment. I don't know what Mark told you, Amy said softly, her voice trembling. But I don't think Mark killed Daniel. I don't believe that. He was hurt, devastated by what happened between us, but he wasn't capable of that. He couldn't have done it. Sarah watched her closely, noticing the way Amy's hands clenched tightly together. There was a vulnerability to her that hadn't been there before. The woman sitting before Sarah now seemed smaller than the one who had confidently hidden her affair for so long. She had been hiding something. Sarah could sense it. I'm not saying your husband killed him, Mrs. Harrison, Sarah said carefully, but I need to understand your relationship with Daniel. How did things start? What was going on between you two? Amy's eyes darted to the side as she wrestled with her emotions. She had spent the past few months telling herself that everything was under control, that no one would find out. But now, with Daniel dead and Mark getting closer to the truth, Amy knew the walls were closing in. She couldn't lie any longer. It started months ago, Amy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark and we've been having problems for a long time. He was always at work, and I felt so alone. And then Daniel, he was there for me. He listened to me when I needed someone. At first it was just talking, but then it became something more. I never meant for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt Mark, but it did. Amy paused, her face crumpling with guilt. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this. It was a mistake. Sarah watched her carefully, noting the sincerity in Amy's voice. There was no doubt in her mind that Amy was telling the truth about the affair, but what troubled Sarah was the timing. Amy was adamant that Mark was not capable of murder, but Sarah needed to ask her the hard questions. I need to ask you something, Mrs. Harrison, Sarah said, her tone serious. Did you ever talk to Daniel about your problems with Mark? Did you mention anything to him about Mark's state of mind? Was he upset, agitated, or acting differently in the days leading up to Daniel's death? Amy's breath hitched, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mark had been angry for weeks. He knew something was wrong. He knew I wasn't happy. He didn't know about the affair at first, but I think he suspected. He was different. He was distant, cold. And the more he suspected, the worse he got. He started asking questions about my whereabouts, and he even started following me. Mark stood by his car, his back stiff, hands in his pockets, clearly trying to hold himself together. But Sarah could see through his facade. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, betrayed the turmoil inside him. The calm he projected was a mask, and beneath it, there was something darker, something that had been simmering for months. He looked like a man on the edge, barely holding on to his composure. Detective, Mark said, his voice strained. I've been thinking about everything, about Daniel, about Amy. I think I need to tell you what really happened. Sarah remained silent for a moment, watching him closely. She had suspected that Mark was hiding something, but she hadn't expected him to come to her now, on his own. He was on the defensive, but there was something in his posture, something vulnerable in the way he spoke. He had been holding back, and now it seemed like he was finally ready to let it all spill out. I'm listening, she said, her voice steady and calm. Mark exhaled sharply, his breath clouding in the cool evening air. His gaze dropped to the ground, and for a moment Sarah wondered if he was going to back out. But then slowly he raised his head and met her eyes. I never meant for this to happen, he began, his voice wavering. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not Daniel. He was my best friend, my partner. We'd been through hell together. But the way things were with Amy, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't handle the lies, the secrecy. I I knew about the affair. I knew about Daniel and Amy. Sarah didn't say anything. She just let him speak, watching carefully for any sign of hesitation or guilt in his words. She had a sense that this was just the beginning, that he was about to reveal more than he realized. It was killing me, Detective, Mark continued, his voice shaking. I couldn't focus at work. I couldn't think straight. Every time I looked at Amy, I saw Daniel in her eyes. Every time I saw him, I saw the man who had taken what was mine. And I couldn't let it go. I tried, but I couldn't. His confession hung in the air, heavy with regret. Sarah felt a cold rush of realization. The desperation in his voice wasn't just the sound of a man who had been wronged. It was the sound of a man who had crossed a line and couldn't take it back. Did you kill Daniel? Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the tension between them. Mark flinched at the question, his face contorting with pain. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if the weight of the question had caught him off guard. He swallowed hard, struggling to find his words. I didn't want to, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But when I found out about them, I lost it. I confronted him, Detective. I confronted him at his apartment. I wanted to understand why he would do this to me, to us. But when I got there, when I saw him, I saw red. I lost control. I don't even remember the moment when I hit him. It was like I was someone else. And then I just kept hitting him. The confession came out in a rush, as though Mark couldn't stop himself now that he had started. Sarah listened carefully, her mind racing as the details of his story began to piece together. Mark had gone to Daniel's apartment the night before the murder, in a fit of rage and betrayal. It was an explosive confrontation, one that had ended in brutal violence. I never meant to kill him, Mark said, his voice breaking. But I did. And now I can't undo it. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart heavy. She had known, deep down, that Mark was involved in the murder, but hearing him confess, seeing the pain in his eyes, made the reality of it hit harder than she had expected. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of betrayal, of a man losing everything he held dear and snapping in the process. You need to tell me everything, Mark, Sarah said firmly, her voice low but commanding. How did you leave the apartment? What did you do after the murder? Mark's shoulders slumped as the weight of the situation seemed to crash down on him. He looked lost, defeated, like a man who had just realized the full extent of what he had done. I left the apartment right after it happened, he said, his voice shaky. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to get caught. I needed to get out of there. I went home, tried to act normal. I told Amy I'd been out on patrol all night. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself, let alone to her. Did Amy know you'd been to Daniel's apartment? Sarah pressed. Mark's eyes flickered with guilt. I told her I was out on patrol. I didn't tell her anything about what happened. I didn't want her to know what I'd done. I couldn't let her know the truth. Sarah's mind was spinning, piecing together the final details of the murder. Mark had killed Daniel in a fit of rage and then tried to cover it up. Mark Harrison was taken into custody without a fight. His eyes were vacant, his posture slumped as though he had given up the moment Sarah had spoken the words of his arrest. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and there was nothing left but the crushing reality that he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the case file in front of her. It was a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and violence, and now that the truth had come out, it all seemed so painfully clear. Mark had killed Daniel in a fit of rage over his wife's affair, but it wasn't just the affair that had driven him to murder. It was the years of pent-up frustration, the feelings of inadequacy, and the paranoia that had built up as he watched his marriage crumble. Daniel had been the final trigger, his best friend, his partner, the man who had unknowingly taken his place. Sarah rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion that was creeping up on her. It had been a long week, and while the case was closed, it hadn't been easy. There had been no easy answers, no neat resolution. Everyone involved had been left broken in some way. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from the precinct, a final update on Mark's confession. She read through it quickly, noting the details of his formal statement and the evidence collected during his arrest. Mark had been cooperative after his initial confession, and he had led them to the clothes he had worn the night of the murder, which were now in evidence, covered in Daniel's blood. The forensics team had also confirmed that the coffee table had indeed been the weapon used to bludgeon Daniel. The case was airtight, but even with all the evidence in place, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered. There was no satisfaction in solving a case like this. The man who had once been a respected officer was now facing a lifetime behind bars, and his family, his wife, his children, would never be the same again. Amy was shattered, not only by Daniel's death, but by the revelation of her husband's actions. She had been caught in a terrible situation, a victim of her own choices, and now she too would have to live with the consequences. As Sarah closed the case file and prepared to leave for the night, she was interrupted by a knock on her door. "Detective Mitchell?" The voice came from the doorway, and Sarah looked up to see Officer Daniels, a young cop who had been working with her on the case. He stepped inside holding a thick manila envelope. "I have the final report on Daniel Carter's background. Thought you'd want to see this before you go home." Sarah nodded, motioning for him to sit. As he handed over the envelope, she tore it open, quickly scanning the contents. It was a thorough background check on Daniel, his personal life, his career, everything. As she flipped through the pages, she found nothing particularly surprising. Daniel had been a dedicated officer, a good man. He had no known enemies, no suspicious activities, no indications that he had ever been involved in anything that could have led to his death. But one particular detail caught Sarah's eye. A letter, handwritten and tucked into the back of the file. The letter was from Daniel to Mark. It was dated just a few weeks before the murder. "Mark," it began, the handwriting neat but shaky. "I know things have been rough between us lately. I can feel the tension, the distance. I just want you to know that I never intended to hurt you. I care about you like a brother, and I want things to get back to normal. Whatever's going on between you and Amy, I'm here to help. I don't want to be the cause of any more pain." Sarah's heart sank as she read the letter again. Daniel had tried to reach out to Mark, to offer support, but Mark had been so consumed by jealousy and anger that he couldn't see it. He had never given Daniel a chance to explain or to repair their relationship. Instead, he had let the rift fester, building the resentment that would eventually lead to murder. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. It was a painful reminder that the tragedy of Daniel's death had been more than just a crime. It had been the culmination of a broken friendship, a marriage in turmoil, and two men who had lost sight of what really mattered. Mark's rage had consumed him, and it had destroyed everything in its path. As Sarah stood up to leave, she thought about the families left in the wake of this tragedy. Amy was facing the consequences of her own choices, but in many ways she was just as much a victim as anyone else. Mark would spend the rest of his life in prison, but Amy's life would never be the same. The affair, the betrayal, the murder, they were all parts of a much larger story, one of human weakness, of desperation, and of choices made in moments of emotional turmoil.